listeners, it's Jana. Welcome back to Grief Out Loud. One of the very first questions that parents and caregivers ask us at Dougy Center is, how do I tell my child that their person died? In 1986, Kristine Ervin was 8, and her father was tasked with telling her and her older brother that their mother had been abducted from the local mall. Several days later, he then had to tell them that their mother's body was found in an oil field. When Kristine asked her father, how did she die? He said the police didn't know. And that was honest because at that point, they didn't actually know how she died. He told Kristine that he hoped that she died the way a rabbit might. That a rabbit who is being chased by a predator will be so afraid that the fear stops their heart before the predator reaches them. This explanation became the title of Kristine's memoir, Rabbit Heart, A Mother's Murder, A Daughter's Story, a memoir that chronicles those early days of grief after her mother's murder, the ways that grief and violence shaped Kristine's adolescence and young adulthood, and then the eventual break in her mother's case that came 2 decades later when a DNA match uncovered the 2 men who were responsible for her murder. That match led to a trial for one of the men, Kyle Eckhart, and his eventual conviction and sentencing. The other man had died prior to the DNA match. I'm telling you so many of these details here because our conversation starts at the beginning and at the end, and I don't want you to feel lost along the way. And because Rabbit Heart is, at its core, a book about grief, not a true crime account. So Kristine and I focus on just that, grief. What it looked like when she was 8, how it shifted over time, and what it's meant to find out more about her mother's violent death as the trial unfolded. Our conversation explores the complexities of memory, imagination, and how grief can shift with every new detail that comes to light. One note before we get started. Kristine is a gifted, visceral writer, and that comes through in how she talks about her mother, the murder, the grief, and how she relates to all of it. So in other words, this episode contains descriptions of violence and sexual assault, so please listen with care. One other thing, Kristine mentions the OSBI in our conversation, and in case you don't know what that is, it stands for the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigations. Okay, here's our conversation. Kristine, welcome to Grief Out Loud.
Thank you. Just grateful to be here.
It's always a little bit of a wild ride for me when I interview someone who has written a book, your memoir, Rabbit Heart, because I feel like I get to know the person through their writing, and your voice has been in my head. Well, my imagination of your voice has been in my head for the last 2 weeks, and then to meet you and see your face and hear your actual voice, it's always, I'm like, wait a minute, which Kristine is this? So I'm just really looking forward to our time together. When you were 8, what did you know to be true about your mother?
It's a fun question because what I remember are the fun things. I was a child, so I know to be true that she loved Hershey Kisses and she loved peanut M&Ms and she loved arts and crafts. Our Christmas tree always had homemade ornaments. So every year she would make new ornaments. And sometimes she would throw an ornament decorating party for me and my friends. She was always needle pointing. So I have memories of her sitting on the couch with the TV on in the corner. And, she's pulling that yarn through the plastic canvas. She chewed her nails. I do remember that. So she, didn't have any fingernails. They were always quite cracked and chewed. It's the thing about her body that I probably remember the most. She smoked Salem cigarettes. And if I happen across someone today who is smoking Salems, it brings her back to me. Not in a way that is exactly good, but that particular smell, because it's a menthol cigarette, it's quite distinctive. So I remember things like ashtrays, and I remember her cigarettes. She loved being homeroom mother. So I don't know if they still do this in elementary school or not. I get the sense that perhaps they don't. But at the time, in the 80s in Oklahoma, you had homeroom mothers, and one mother would be assigned to a class, and they would bring treats in or or help with show and tell. Or my mother, for Easter, she dressed up as the Easter bunny and brought a pinata to class that was shaped as an Easter egg. She also put fake spiders in it. So I can read that now as somebody who had a sense of humor. I certainly thought it was funny at the time, you know. She loved being at the lake with us. She didn't grow up on lakes, but we got a ski boat when I was a child, and we had many happy weekends during the summer at the lake. And she learned how to water ski, and she got an inflatable boat that we attempted to pull behind the boat, although it didn't work well. It started to go under, but it would only seat one person. And she got a decal for it that said HMS, for Her Majesty's Ship. And so, again, I think this is a woman who had a sense of humor, even though, again, at 8 years old, that's not how you think about it, of course. So that's my reflecting back on what I know to be true and what that means. But I have such fragmented memories. I don't have many memories that are my own. So it's limited in that way because I was young enough. And that's something that I've struggled with in my own grief, is not knowing who my mother was as a full human being.
Which kind of leads us into the next, wondering about, for so many kids who were young, you were only 8 when your mom was killed, they do have to go to other people or to other sources to learn more about their person. And so as more has been revealed about your mom's life and her death over time, like, what do you know to be true about her today?
I'm fascinated by the question because the answer is I don't know anything to be true because it is being filtered from other people. It's going through their own memory. It's going through their own interpretations of her. So that is a difference that I see between your first question and your second question. The memories that I just gave you from the 8-year-old, I know those to be true because I know that they did not come from others. Those are memories that I know are mine. And that's why they're so limited. I mean, the ones that I gave you, I don't have many more other than those. So, what I know to be true as my mother is a fuller human being and as a woman, again, I don't know it to be true. I just have a sense from others' interpretations, others' memories, other stories. And so, yes, of course, I came of age wanting to know more about her. And, you know, as I have aged and going into middle age myself, you know, my questions have changed over the years. I was just asking my father some questions when I was there last week, in fact. My memory is that my mother was, you know, I had her up on a pedestal. She was the best mother ever. I was a child, you know, and so my recollection of her is very much in that vein. My father, when I was coming of age, he would say things like, well, she was a better wife than a mother. And that does not, as my father would say, that does not jibe with my memory or my experience. And the stories that he would tell would be that after my brother was born, after I was born, she did not have to work. Financially, my father, it was important to him that his salary could cover the necessities and that she could choose to stay at home. And she chose not to. She loved computer programming. And what she said to my father was, you can talk to the baby all day, but the baby doesn't talk back. And she needed something outside of being a mother. Sometimes she would socialize after work and she would call my father and say, hey, get a babysitter and come meet me out. And he stayed at home. So this is kind of the narrative that he would say was, well, you know, your mother was there for you, yes, but again, his narrative, she was a better wife. She wanted to go out and socialize and have him with her. He was a better father, he says, and a better spouse. He was the one who stayed home with me and my brother. That is not my memory, though. I remember my mother being there. I remember being very close to her. I remember snuggling with her, wanting to snuggle with her, and having that time. So this is what I mean in terms of what I know to be true. When you start having these other layers come in, it does make everything quite fuzzy. So she did, again, love computer programming. I hear she was a riot from her girlfriends. I do have some memories of bunco nights There's a game called Bunko. I think it's similar to Yahtzee. I don't know the game rules, but women would come over to the house, and I remember just laughing women, screaming women, playing these games, and wine and peanut M&Ms and regular M&Ms and peanuts. And I know that because I went downstairs to steal them when she wasn't looking. But I just remember laughter. I have since connected with one of her friends. Haven't had too many conversations, but she talked about going to a Barry Manilow concert together with my mother, and that they would use binoculars to stare at his backside and laugh the whole time. So I believe her to be a woman who did enjoy the company of other women, who did laugh, who wanted a fuller life beyond only a mother, only being a mother, but also, being an extraordinary mother in my memory, at least. Yeah. Is that enough, or shall I keep going on and on and on?
Well, it does make me think about one other aspect that I think is unique to when someone dies in a way that becomes public, that becomes the news. And I wondered, in a sense, the folks who knew the person best, who were their family, almost lose control of the narrative of that person's life. And that person's life gets reconstructed or presented in a certain way through media and other sources. So I just wondered if there were things about the way your mom's life and death got portrayed in the media that didn't match up with what you knew to be true about her.
In some ways, I feel like we were lucky with the 80s in Oklahoma, just the circumstances. I don't feel like we necessarily lost control of the narrative of her life. And part of that is we decided not to do television shows. So if a TV show reached out to my family, and we've been contacted several times, we often said no. We got close to doing one, but ultimately decided against it. So as far as her life, there weren't that many stories being told about her as a living human being, as a living woman. So what is out there in a public way is primarily focused on her death. And for a long time, that those details were, coming from newspaper articles. They weren't too sensationalized. They were focused primarily on the facts. It wasn't until a little bit later that I felt like I was losing control of the story of her death too. So this is when the Daily Oklahoman, or it may have been known as the Oklahoman then, because they changed their names, my brother reached out to them to write an article for the Daily Oklahoman, or the Oklahoman created a cold case series. And so a journalist would write stories of cold cases as a way to bring them back into the public sphere and as a way to encourage work to continue to be done on them. And so my brother reached out to the journalist, and the journalist interviewed me and my brother and my father. And the way the journalist wrote her death was something I was not comfortable with. So he wrote the scene of her abduction from Shepherd Mall. And when he did so, he entered my mother's head and said what she was thinking. And it was just one line or two, but essentially perhapsing, although didn't use the word perhaps, which is a part of the problem, but saying that my mother was wanting to get home to her children. And it deeply disturbed me that someone who did not know my mother would write a little from her perspective without acknowledgement of the ethics of that, without acknowledgement that there's no way that he can know, without acknowledgement that the narrative that he was providing to the reader was aligned with gender stereotypes, without acknowledgement that perhaps she didn't want to get home to her children. Nobody knows that. And that was the first time I remember really losing control of the story itself of her death and not taking it well. So, and it is one thing as the writer and the family. I have had control of the story. There's comfort in that. And then there's discomfort in offering it out to the world and not knowing what might come back to me.
This might be a weak parallel, but it does make me think about the difference between when maybe a supportive family member or friend comes to, offer what they hope to be comforting words to a child or a teen who is grieving, and they share the facts of something that they know to be true about their parent who died versus what they share an assumption about what the parent who died thought or felt. And an example would be, say someone's graduating from high school, and to say, I remember so many conversations I had with your mom about how excited she was for you to graduate, versus your mom would be so proud of you today, or your mom wouldn't want you to be sad today, or your mom wouldn't want you to do this or do that, when that's such a different experience of like, how dare you? You don't know you knew my person, but you don't know what they were thinking in that exact moment, versus here's something that you experienced with them and can share that with me.
Absolutely. And over the years, I have felt resistance to individuals who will say, well, your mother would be proud of you. Even my own brother saying that to me at my graduation from my PhD, saying, Mom would be so proud of you. I didn't say anything to him in the moment. It's coming from a good place, of course. But that resistance of, well, you don't know that. I don't know that. Nobody knows that. We can infer that a parent likely would be quite proud of someone graduating from a PhD, but really we don't know because we don't know her. But I will also say that I've had other moments when that same phrase can be an extraordinary comfort, or it can be exactly what I want to hear in that moment. So I think back to 2 years ago now, year and a half ago, when Rabbit Heart launched. And I had a launch reading on campus at Westchester University, and it was just, it was perfect. And it was just a space of joy and love and celebration, and also a collapsing of my worlds because all of my personas were in the room. I mean, my students were there, and my friends were there, and writers were there, my editor, my agent, and my husband, and it was just, the friend that I go drink wine with, or the people I go to the dog park with, all in the same room. And that was new for me. But a woman I met in Greece at a writing workshop several years back, she came up from Washington, D.C., and she is someone who is a friend, but also is quite maternal. She's always poking me to drink more water because I don't drink water. And she doesn't want me to go swimming across a shipping lane, even though I want to get to this island that I can see. And after I read, she came up to me and she embraced me, and forgive the language, but she said, your mother would be so fucking proud of you. And she just held me, and I just broke down. And I felt in that moment, this is what my mother would want me to hear. And of course, I don't know that, but in that moment, that's what I felt. And it was authentic. And again, my friend who is occupying this role of friend and mother was a perfect person I needed to hear that from. And so, yes, and yes, and no.
And no.
And there's no rhyme or reason into, what moments offer comfort and what moments it's frustrating.
Which is, I'm just laughing a little to myself because, part of the work that I do is around supporting people who are grieving, and part of it's around training and supporting people who want to be supportive to those who are grieving. And I'm always like, well, you could say this and someone will hate it, and you could say the same thing and someone will love it. And you could say the same thing to the same person 2 days from now and they'll like it better. So good luck.
Yes, exactly. Good luck. And again, those who have said it to me over the years, even when I have felt resistance, for the most part, I don't say anything because it's coming from a place of love most often, and support most often. Again, what I just did not like about the journalist was the ways in which his narrative was really reading or feeding into the narrative of a perfect woman, innocent victim, truly innocent victim, which we have a history with, even detectives calling my mother that. And then the way that has the broader context, right? Well, who is a truly innocent victim? And what does that mean now if you don't have an innocent victim? And that is all wrapped up in the way that we blame women. So that was my deep discomfort with the journalist, because again, it was not coming from a place of support. It was coming from a place of trying to write an enticing story that is aligned with gender stereotypes. And I do understand the purpose was to get the public to care, but I think it's problematic the way that he went about it.
Can we go back a little to when you were 8?
Yeah.
And I'm curious, what do you remember about the days in the weeks after your mom went missing? Like, how did that news get communicated to you?
For the most part, I think I remember very little, and or what I do remember is not what I wish to remember. So I remember silly things. I remember my My Little Ponies. I remember the day my teachers came over and what outfit I wore. And I remember loving the attention. I remember the banana pudding my second grade teacher gave me. I remember the African violet. I remember the card. For a long time, and I think it's still in me, I have felt guilt for having the memory of loving the attention while my mother's body was rotting in a field. And I look at an 8-year-old, if I'm ever around an 8-year-old, which isn't too often, but I think they look old to me, and I think partly 8-year-olds just appear more mature than they probably are. But I think I should be able to remember more. I should be able to remember differently. So I remember again details about toys or friends being at my house or teachers being at my house. The moments of grief or the moments of pain, they're limited. So I do remember the morning that my father woke me up. And so the sunlight would stream through my bedroom window in the morning, and I didn't have a clock in the room. And we had an intercom system that just sat on these little intercoms sat on like my nightstand, and they were placed throughout the house. And it wasn't that big of a house, so it's kind of funny to me that we had these. I think my father just loved technology more than anything, and it was, this novelty. But my mother would wake me up by intercom. So she would press the call button, which just make this annoying, loud sound. And then you would press talk and you would speak into it. And she would tell me to wake up and I would ask for 5 more minutes. And then she would maybe give me that. I remember going back to sleep and waiting for the second call. And so she would call and then I would get up. And her room was right across the hall from mine. So again, it's just funny that this is how we communicated. But that morning, I kept waking up and the sun just appeared too bright in my bedroom. And I was confused because I had not heard the intercom. No one had come in to wake me up. And I kept trusting my mother that, oh, well, she knows I have school or she knows when I need to get up. So I'd fall back asleep and I would wake up and fall back asleep. So it is funny, I remember that sunlight very vividly. And I remember Toad, my stuffed animal, where he was placed in the room. My father then and my brother walked in and they sat on my bed. And all these years, I thought my father used the word kidnapped, that he said my mother was kidnapped. And then years later, I learned that he used the word abducted. And he used that word because it's more accurate. So I know so much more about my father than I do my mother. And I can tell you that my father values accuracy. So he used the word abducted because abduction does not involve a ransom, where the word kidnapping does. But abduction was a word I did not understand, and my brother did not understand. So it's my brother's memory that my father used this word and then had to explain it as a kidnapping. So I don't remember abduction, but I do remember kidnapping there. I remember my father's tearing up and that was terrifying. I didn't think daddies were supposed to cry. I had never seen my father cry. It was not a sobbing. It wasn't a heaving. It was restrained in the way that my father grieves, but it was still terrifying to an 8-year-old girl. And I don't remember everything that was said beyond his tears and beyond my memory of kidnapping. And then he left the room and my brother left the room and I went to get dressed. And my neighbors came in, women friends of my mother. And I was naked because I was in the middle of getting dressed. And they came in and they hugged me and they were crying. And I remember feeling like they wanted something from me, but I didn't understand what. What I wanted was for them to leave my room because I was nude and I was getting dressed and I was embarrassed. I remember going back to school while she was still missing, just a very vague memory of being in the hallway outside the classroom. And it seemed like most of the students were already in the classroom and I was entering that space, almost as if I had gotten to school late. I don't know if that was the case or not. I remember my mother's face on the news. So, and the photograph specifically, I remember there were news reporters outside in our front yard, and I wanted to be on TV, and my father wouldn't let me. So again, that's the memory of the child, right? That was what I valued. I wanted the attention. I wanted to be the TV star. As far as when my father actually told us that they had found the body and that it was her body, that she had died, I have zero memory of that moment. I have no idea where we were, when we were, how it was delivered, who was there, who wasn't there. I really have very few memories of anyone in the house, even though people were in the house. Family came in. I don't remember there being there. So, yeah, toys, attention, couple moments of pain. It's very little, really, that I have.
Kristine, do you, and you just said you don't have very many memories, so you made me like, I don't remember. But when you were 8 and in that window of time between when you learned that your mom had been abducted to when they had found her body, were there ways that you tried to intervene in your little kid way?
Oh, absolutely. Well, try to, no. Fantasize about, yes. So I do remember staying awake at night, and I wish I had a word for this state, because daydreaming suggests it's during the day. So what do you do when you daydream at night? It's a silly problem, but it bothers me that we don't have a word for this moment. That when you are not falling asleep and you are ruminating, I want a word for this. That it's not as big as ruminate. But I would fantasize about ways that I could save my mother. So this was in the time that she was missing. I had a recurring daydream, rumination, fantasy that I wrote my mother a note. And it was very specific note paper that I planned to write it. It was note paper that she had given me. And it wasn't very big. It was like 3.5 by 5. It had a blue border, and down in the corner it had hearts of primary colors. I imagined writing her a letter. I don't remember what I had planned to write, but I imagined writing her a letter. I imagined opening the window to my bedroom and the screen wouldn't be there. In fantasy, you don't have to worry about things like that. Like, what do you do with the screen that's blocking your way? The screen wasn't there in my fantasy. And in Oklahoma, we have very strong wind, of course. And I do love that wind. And I would hold the note outside my window, and the wind would take it and it would carry it to the car. And I imagine the car on the highway most of the time, but that paper would flutter in through the open window of the car. She would begin reading it. The men who kidnapped her, abducted her, would read it. They would feel sorry for what they did, and they would bring her back. And I went to my father in the daylight hours and I asked him if I could do this. I told him about my dream and asked him if I could fly a note out the window. He said, "You can try if you think it will help." And I never did. And that's a regret that I think I had growing up, is that I didn't make that attempt. As ridiculous as it is, it was an attempt. And in some ways, I think of Rabbit Heart, the memoir, as a form of that letter. I know it's my speaking to her in some ways, speaking to the men too, speaking to my grief, speaking to others who are grieving. So it's a much longer version of the note that I wish the wind would carry. And then after she died, the fantasies changed to that she was in witness protection somewhere, and that I would find her or that she would return. So I had sleeping dreams and fantasies of her returning because I never had any closure. I never saw the body. I don't know if that would help. Part of me thinks it would, but I don't really know. But I didn't have closure in that form. So there's always this question of, was that really her body? Is this just a story that we've been told for some reason from the police? Is she in New York wandering the streets, and can I find her there? Is she in some small town that I'll eventually visit and I'll come across her? Will she return for my sweet 16? Will she return for my graduation? Will she return for my wedding? And even as an adult, those fantasies can continue. So when I was engaged and about to get married to Jerry, I would sometimes fall asleep to the fantasy that she would return and I would see her on my wedding day. The imagination plays a huge role in grief, I think.
Yeah, I really appreciate you, because I was going to ask you, and in which way do those continue as an adult? Because oftentimes we think of kids grieve this way and adults grieve this way. And I'm like, there are echoes in both directions. It just shows up very differently. But it's not like you turn 18 and you stop having these wonderings and these sort of magical thoughts of the fact that the person could still be out there
Yeah.
somewhere.
And when I lived in New York, I went to NYU for my master's. And so I lived 2 years in New York City. And I saw my mother in multiple places. And part of it was that during that time, the retro look at brown leather blazers from the 70s came back in style. And so I would see women on the street with these blazers that looked like my mother's. Or I would see a woman on a train platform with hair that for some reason reminded me of my mother's. And I was constantly turning corners and or again, a Salem cigarette. I would pass by a woman with a Salem cigarette and suddenly think, is that my mother? That's happened far less regularly as I've aged. I'm not quite sure why. I don't know if it's connected to the resolution to the case. I don't know if it's just what happens middle age, late middle age, knowing that she would appear as an old woman now as opposed to the woman in her 40s as I remember her. So I'm not sure why it changed, but it does happen much less frequently that I encounter a woman that for a brief moment I think could be my mother.
Well, you bring up that idea of how things change over time, and you have lived with the absence of your mother for this time since you were 8. And then you also lived with the absence of knowing who it is that kidnapped
Yeah.
and killed her. What was that like to grow up without that knowing, without that fact?
That was horrific. And I don't use that word lightly. It's horror. It's a form of horror. Some days worse than other days. Because I would pass a man on the street and wonder if he was a man. I would have terrifying daydreams, where the men would return. They would return for me, especially because there are some physical resemblances between me and my mother. Even if I can't see them, I've been told about them from others. And so there was this thought of, would they come back for me for some reason? Would they show up at the house? Would I be arriving home from school? And would I be abducted from my driveway? So just as I had fantasies about my mother's return or fantasies about seeing my mother again or wondering if that mother across the way is my mother, same thing with the men. And so it's this form of presence, even though you don't know who the person is. And it's a presence that has a weight to it, is a presence that is deeply unsettling and lives in the body, even if you're not always aware of it, even if it's not always in the foreground, it's there. So it was terrible not knowing. And then it was terrible in a different way, in some ways a worse way, when we had the DNA match against Kyle Eckhart, but they were not going to charge him because the evidence wasn't strong enough. So here they're saying, oh, we have this DNA and we believe this is definitely the man who killed her and we can't do anything about it. So then all of those questions, those wonderings, those ruminations, those dreams and daydreams crystallized into a person, and I had no agency to do anything about it. So that was a rough period too of knowing, but still not having any form of resolution.
Because it goes from, it could be any man that I see on the street to it's this specific man,
Yeah.
and he could eventually be on the street.
Yes. And different fantasies come with that scenario, right? And I'm sure my brother and my father went through this too. We don't speak all that much about the specifics of our grief, which speaks to the power of your podcast, right? You are wanting to give voice to grief because so often there's silence around it. But if he had been released, there are plenty of fantasies on how I would have taken care of that situation.
Yeah, I wonder, Kristine, if you could just give like a brief overview of like what you knew about the case before the DNA break came, and then kind of how things resolved since then.
One of the gifts of writing the memoir is that I now have the ability to forget timeline and forget details. So forgive me that I won't be highly detailed in the way that I probably would have been about 4 years ago, because the memoir has allowed me to let go in a way that I did not anticipate. So two men were sitting outside of Shepherd Mall in 1986, and there were multiple eyewitnesses who saw them just sitting there. They looked out of place for Shepherd Mall. Shepherd Mall was in, at the time, kind of an affluent neighborhood. It was the first mall in Oklahoma City. The money had begun shifting northward, but the descriptions from the eyewitnesses that, again, these were two men who just did not look like they belonged in that space. It was a random abduction. My mother stopped by the mall after work one day to return a birthday gift. And so it was in the evening, about dusk, and they forced her into her car and drove off. Her body was found in western Oklahoma in an oil field. The car was found in New Mexico. And they did have two suspects in the couple years after the abduction. Two suspects who had ties to New Mexico, had ties to another kidnapping. They were half brothers. And we were told that these were the men who killed my mother, that there were enough similarities in the case, or the two cases, my mother's and the other abduction, that they felt like these definitely were the men. They just didn't have enough evidence. The fingerprints didn't match. There wasn't enough evidence in the car at the time. The type of forensics that we have today, of course, was not available in the 80s. But what they kept saying is this is not a one-time type of crime. Somebody who commits murder this way, it most often happens again. So the police were really kind of zeroed on these two men. But the evidence didn't point to it. There were some pieces of evidence, but nothing that was strong, and nothing, again, like fingerprints or DNA, because we didn't have DNA at the time. Years later, then, after we had the cold case article written, after my brother had kept in contact with the police, after he had really pushed to have DNA testing done on evidence in the car, which they did get evidence, then it matched to a man named Kyle Eckhart. So Eckhart he was charged first with aggravated assault and battery and rape by instrumentation against a woman named Terry Welch. Terry Welch died. They did not charge him with murder because of circumstances in the case that seemed like mistakes, honestly, from somebody who was on the outside of it. So Terry Welch died, and he was connected to her death, although not charged with it. He ended up giving a plea bargain agreement where he got out of the rape charge so he would not have to register as a sex offender. He was charged and convicted of 2 counts of aggravated assault and battery. When he was convicted of that, his DNA went into the federal database. And that is then when it got the match in my mother's case. Once it got the match in my mother's case, though, it was to a piece of evidence in the car that was not connected to my mother. So it was from cigarette butts that were left in the car. And what we were told is, because there was a gap in time between when the car was abandoned at a truck stop and when it was found by police, all the defense would have to say is, well, Eckhart, who is a transient, got in an abandoned vehicle after the murderers had abandoned it. And he sat in there and he smoked some cigarettes and ate some food and masturbated. We can't prove that he was in the car at the same time as your mother. And this is why we can't charge him. So that's that period that I'm talking about, that his DNA was all over the car, which is strong evidence to me, and I think would be strong evidence to most individuals. But there wasn't anything evidence-wise that said he was in the car at the same time as my mother. He had a history of violence against women, a long history. So there was that connection too. And it was just harder than I ever thought it could be. I had always fantasized about learning who it was. I had never considered what it would mean if we were given a name. And as you said, it's crystallizing into a person. I have a face, I have a history, I have a video of him moving. So he's no longer this idea. He is a human being. He is a man that I want to hurt. and I can't do anything about it. And it appeared at that time that neither could the judicial system. I struggled. We all struggled. I cannot say enough for the people who work at the OSBI, for the work that they do for victims' families. They continue to work on the case, and they worked on some of the evidence some more. And they were able to get a mixture sample of my mother's DNA and Eckhart's DNA on a beer bottle cap. And so once that mixture sample, once the OSBI discovered it, did the testing that brought that to light, then that crossed the timeline. And they said, we can charge them now because it said that they were in the car at the same time. But that still wasn't an easy time, of course, because slowly, and this goes from the age of 8 all the way to the resolution to the case, we learned a little bit at a time, in more graphic and more violent detail what happened. And so this speaks to the ways that my grief, and a grief like this, it's brutal and it's relentless because it's just, you keep adding to it. And in my case, it was brutal detail after a more brutal detail after a more brutal detail. And so it was a deepening of a wound every time we learned more information, as opposed to a healing of a wound. So the judicial process, we were lucky that we got a resolution that I won't say we're happy with, but a resolution that we are at peace with. But it came at a cost.
And he was sentenced to life without parole.
He was. So it became a death penalty case in the state of Oklahoma, which I was ambivalent about in a way that my brother and father were not. They were quite clear about what they wanted. They wanted a death penalty, where I'm usually exist in a gray space. So, and it was our decision as a family. The district attorney at the time was quite respectful of me and my family in a way that I appreciate. Also in ways that I wonder are problematic, but on a personal level, I felt very much respected and seen. And it became a death penalty case because of additional details that came to light, more evidence that came forward regarding the manner of her death, the cause of death itself. And we were about a month away from trial. So we went through the preliminary hearing, which in the state of Oklahoma, this is where the prosecution presents evidence to a judge, and a judge says there's enough evidence to move forward to a jury trial. So we were in the courtroom with Eckhart. We did hear the primary evidence. We weren't faced with like the car or the physical samples yet, but we certainly were faced with the descriptions of the evidence. So we were kind of in that space and moving forward to the jury trial about 1 month out. And Eckhart decided to accept a plea bargain agreement that we as a family agreed to, that it would be life without parole with no appeals in exchange for not going to jury trial with the death penalty.
I'm always struck when I listen or read or talk with someone who has had someone who was killed and then interacts with the judicial system. And I hadn't thought about what you said until you said it a moment ago, of how each time you learned more details of things being revealed of how your mother died, that you go back to your grief again in a different way. And it's, I think about like you as a child grieving for the mother that was no longer there. And now there's grieving for the mother who's still not there, and also how she died. And your whole memoir sort of reads that way, as if like every time there's a new break in the case, so to speak, or new details that come through, it's like having to go through the grief, not all over again because you're still in it, but with this new information, like this new lens comes through. Yeah, I don't know if I have an actual question in there, but just curious, like, what's your perception or understanding of that?
And again, this speaks to one of the goals of the memoir, is to show that form of grief, because it is a different form of grief. Absolutely. My father right now is terminally ill. I am slowly losing him to cancer and to COPD. It is a different grief. And it's one that when he passes, I'm going to grieve deeply, but I will feel at peace about it. There will be an acceptance to it that I find very difficult to achieve in the case of violence and in the case of this experience of learning little by little the horrors that she experienced. And so, yes, as an 8-year-old, I was grieving the mother who was not there. And I have continued to grieve the mother who is not here, of course. I still have moments when I think, I wish my mother were here to tell me this, or I wonder what my mother would think about this. That's grief, but that's different than knowing the violence that I know now and how that violence has lived in my body, seeing that violence that is so pervasive in the culture, whether that's pop culture and film and television, whether that is the exchanges that I have with my students who experience abuse at the hands of men all the time, who have experienced rape at the hands of men many times. It's just, I am surrounded by violence. And again, that violence is in me now because anytime I learned something horrible that happened to my mother as a woman, I have either experienced that myself, I have wanted to experience that so I could feel connected to her, or I have imagined it to my own body. One of the things one of the things I did question when I was coming of age with this form of grief is how much do I want to know? Because without knowing the cause of death, the exact cause of death, yes, I knew she was abducted. Yes, I knew her body was abandoned in an oil field. That's about all I had. Yes, as I was coming of age, I had more of an understanding of violence against women and more of an understanding of rape than I did at 8 years old. But all of that is still more or less existing in the imagination. I can imagine her dying by a gun. I can imagine her dying by a knife. I can imagine her dying by strangling. I can imagine her dying by being abandoned in a field and she starves. I had a million scenarios, and that was exhausting and horrific in its own way. So I had always wondered, is it worse to have limitless possibilities that I can imagine, or is it worse knowing the truth, knowing the facts? And I can say now it's worth having the facts and knowing the truth. I'd much rather have the imagination because with the imagination, I might not be able to get back to the bunny rabbit and a very innocent version of her death, but I can at least imagine something kinder, something a little softer than how it actually happened. And now that I know that Eckhart slit her throat from behind, anytime there's a knife in a scene on a television show or in a movie, I have to close my eyes. Anytime I see somebody, draw a knife across their throat as like, I'm done with this, I think of my mother. Anytime somebody says something about, oh, I'm going to be left outdoors and vultures are going to pick apart my bones, I think about my mother. Anytime I see a dead deer on the road and there are turkey vultures on the body, I think about her. So the imagination can offer horror, but the imagination can also be a gift.
Because it's not concrete. It's not one single story that you know to be true.
Yeah.
You mentioned the softness of the rabbit. So I wanted to give you an opportunity to share kind of the story of the origin of the name of your memoir, Rabbit Heart.
Yeah, so this goes back to memory. I don't know when I asked my father this, meaning how close to the time of my learning that she died, I asked him, but it wasn't that long after my father said that they found her body and she was dead. So whether it was after the funeral, who knows? But I was still young. I was still 8. And I was snuggled with my father on the couch, as I often did when I was hurting. I started asking questions about her death. And I asked him how she died. Again, I knew that 2 men had taken her, but even at 8 years old, I wanted to know, how did she die? And that astounds me now. It astounds me because I wish the 8-year-old didn't even think that question, but she did. I did. So I asked, how did mom die? And my father, his philosophy was never to lie to his children. Be direct, be simple, but don't lie. And I really respect him for that. I'm not quite certain how he navigated it all those years, but so he was honest. And he said, the police don't know. Because her body had been outdoors for a week, It had decomposed to the level that the police could not determine a specific cause of death. My father was honest in his answer. He said the police don't know. And I asked him why, and he gave me very scientific language. He said, because her body was exposed to elements and had begun to decompose. And that's a form of a gift too, keeping it in this language that I accepted and did not fully understand. I did not know that meant there might not be a lot of my mother's body left. I just was like, okay. But it did prompt the question, well, if they can't determine that because she was exposed to elements, then how did they even know it was her? And there's that hope of my 8-year-old self. That's the story I'd already been telling, that this wasn't my mother. This was another body. My mother's somewhere else. My mother's alive. And he said through her dental records. And I had no idea that you could identify somebody through their teeth. So then I'm thinking, oh, I've had a cavity. This is how they would identify me. And I thought it was kind of cool. Only now do I think it's a little weird for an 8-year-old to think that. But again, that's the child self. And then at some point, while I'm snuggled against him and I can hear the crinkle of his cigarettes in his shirt pocket, which is a comforting sound to me, strangely enough. And I had my hand on his stomach, and I always said that he swallowed his pillow while he was snoring because I like to have my head there. I asked him, I said, how do you think she died? And he said, I hope she died like a bunny rabbit would. And he started describing that bunny rabbits, if they're being chased by a predator, they can get so scared that their heart stops pumping. And he basically described a heart attack before the predator ever reaches them. And that was the first version that I had of my mother's death. Was, I won't say an easy version, but a softer one, because I imagined she was in the backseat of her car and that she was scared. And of course, I didn't want my mother to be scared, but I imagined her heart quietly stopping, not even a violent seizing, not even what we know heart attacks can often be, but a going to sleep. I saw the bunny that way, and I saw my mother that way. And it was a gift. It was a real gift that he offered me, that for at least a period of a couple years, I could believe in a quieter death. And then the evidence destroyed that. I can't get back to the bunny.
Which makes me want to ask, the choice to use Rabbit Heart as the title of your memoir, which is to bring the softer version into the reality of the version that wasn't soft at all, that you kind of unfold page by page. So, was that a conscious? I'm guessing it was a conscious choice. You chose your title, but
well, I did and I didn't. So the original title was "The Distance to You." That was what my dissertation was called. My dissertation was a very different project because we didn't have the resolution to the case, and so it didn't have that narrative arc that I suddenly was faced with after the resolution to the case, and I didn't know how to handle that in terms of the structure of the book. I struggled for a long time trying to see what the book was supposed to be after the story changed drastically on me. So The Distance to You was a line from a poem I had written where I have this kind of memory of being at my mother's grave in winter, which I do know that happened, and it had snowed. And so the family, whoever was there, and I don't remember who it was, we had to, uncover the grave marker because it's a pillow grave marker. It's not like an upright marker. And so had to uncover it from the snow. My memory of it, and this speaks to your very early question, like how we rewrite, we write over, we revise our memories. So part fantasy, part memory is I'm the one doing the digging as a way to get down to my mother. And this fantasy is about trying to lessen the distance, trying to close the distance between us. And a lot of my coming of age with the experiences that I had with men, with experiences that I had, and what I don't want to call relationships because that sounds healthier than what it was, but abuse that I experienced at the hands of men. Part of the investigation of the self that I do in the memoir is the question of how much did I seek out violence against my body as a way to connect with my mother. So that's that form of trying to close the distance, trying to learn more about her death, wondering if I should look at the photographs, wondering if I should hold the evidence. That too is a question of like getting closer to the mother, learning stories about her, trying to get closer to my mother. And so I felt like The Distance to You was a title that could speak to that experience of all the different ways of wanting to get closer to my mother. And I had that as my working title for a while. And I was trying to get a literary agent at the time, which in memoir, if you're wanting to publish with a bigger press or a reputable smaller press, you have to have a literary agent. And they are then the ones that shop your manuscript to the editors, so that there's really no direct path to the editors without the literary agents. And so I was trying to get an agent, and they have these essentially speed dating for agents. These things that you go to and you have 5 minutes to pitch your book. It's awful. I'm terrible at it. I talk too much. But anyway, I had met this agent, and she read the manuscript, and she did not sign me, but she gave me some wonderful feedback. And her feedback was, why don't you consider A Rabbit's Heart? So not Rabbit Heart, but A Rabbit's Heart for your title. And I remember first reading that and feeling very resistant to it, because it was kind of like taking this moment with my father and what felt in the moment like not sensationalizing it, but amplifying it in a way that it felt melodramatic or sensational. But as I continued working on the manuscript, and as I was writing scenes of the trial and adding the trial to the manuscript, I saw ways in which the bunny was getting revised. So the bunny, that story, I don't have the version from my father, but it became violence, just seeing the bunny as the prey that is very much, in the dog's mouth. But then a woman in my life, woman I call my pseudo mom, allowed me to see my mother in a particular way that made me think of my mother as a woman who is powerful, a woman with agency, a woman who would say, fuck you. And so I imagine a powerful female bunny that would stand up against a dog and would burst her own heart before the dog could get to her. So that bunny, of course, exists only in metaphor. This isn't, I don't believe that my mother could burst her own heart in the backseat of that car, but I liked reworking the memory again. And this is where, again, the imagination can be a gift, bringing in the metaphor that allowed me to celebrate my mother and to celebrate the bunny. So it's not a soft version. Now it's a powerful version. So once I started seeing how the bunny became an extended metaphor beyond this one moment with my father, then I went back to that agent's feedback and I thought, actually, I think this can work.
Kristine, as we come to the end of our time together, which feels so short, and I know there's so much more to talk about, how would you describe the relationship that you have with your mother now on the other side of completing the memoir, publishing it, having it out in the world?
I find this question really tricky because my first response, which is not a helpful response, I don't think, is that I don't have a relationship. So I think there's no way for me to answer this question. And then I start thinking about, well, how are we defining relationship, right? So let me get outside of this one view that a relationship has to be a dialogue, because that's what I don't have, right? I don't have my mother here speaking with me. I don't have this exchange going back and forth. And there may be individuals who have lost loved ones who do feel like a relationship continues beyond death. But that isn't my experience, at least with my mother. And perhaps because I was so young and I didn't know her as a person, perhaps because of the violence, perhaps because that's just who I am, that I don't see exchanges happening beyond death. That being said, the way that I felt about my mother's death as an 8-year-old versus what I think about her and her death now, sure, if I think about that as a form of relationship, then it's easier to answer. And so there it's still with deep sadness that I won't ever know my mother. Even if I interview family members or friends, which I've done a little bit of, but there's this awareness that I can't ever get to my mother. Those are interpretations of her, those are memories of her, and they're valid, but they aren't her. What I am wanting is my mother's voice telling me things. I'm wanting my mother to tell me how she felt about her first husband. And I hear he was domineering. What was that like? I want to know how my mother would vote today. I want to know what my mother would think about the chocolate chip cookie recipe and whether it needs that much flour or not, and why these cookies turn out differently every single time. I don't understand. So it's everything from the silly to the serious. I'm wanting my mother to give me advice, middle age, relationships, all these things. And I won't ever have that. So the sadness has remained the same. Knowing more and more violence, that has made her death harder over the years. And I have to live with that violence, as I said, in my body. But the surprise of Rabbit Heart, what I never anticipated, ever. I started writing about her death when I was 13 years old. I wrote a terrible poem. I was 13, of course it was terrible, about her abduction and about her death. And it was my needing to express my grief. And that's the form it took. My brother and my father were silent most of the time. And for me, I had to have an outlet, and that was mine. And it wasn't only my need to express, but it was my need to control and to shape. So when you're talking about controlling the story, I firmly believe that I stuck with poetry for so long because it is a form that is tightly controlled. I didn't write in meter or rhyme, but I had line breaks. And there was something very painful about putting the first draft on the page. But once it's on the page, you begin manipulating it. You break the line here, you break it there, or you choose this word or that metaphor. And in the shaping of the story is when I felt like I gained control over the thing I could not control. And I've been doing that since the age of 13 to what I am now at 47. And I had assumed that I would continue doing that because it's been such a part of my life that I am writing my mother's death over and over and over, and I'm revising it and shaping it and trying to find the right words for it. And a new detail may change it, and then I change it again. When Rabbit Heart arrived in the mail, so when you're an author, the publishing company sends you your author copies before they ever go out into the world. So this is about a month before the book release. And I was sitting here at my desk in my house, and my husband was out in the yard, and he goes over the front porch and he lifts up a box, and it says Penguin Random House on it. And I was in a Zoom meeting, and I lost it. I just started screaming, and he came in and he's just standing there holding this box telling me to get off of my meeting, like just cut the meeting off. I was running it. And I eventually got out of the Zoom meeting, and I took the box, and I knew that I wanted to open it by my mother's piano, which is right here behind me. And this is a piano that's never been tuned. She bought it because she liked the looks of it, which is hilarious to me. She didn't play the piano. She didn't care about playing the piano. She just loved antiques, and she loved wood. So it sounds terrible. It's like 140 years old, this piano. And I knew I wanted to open this box next to this piano because piano means so much to me. And again, it too is a memory I have. So I opened the box, and Rabbit Heart became gendered for me at that moment. I do recognize that this sounds like a birthing, and I don't mean it that way, but the book became a she to me. It became a her. So you'll hear me refer to her in this way. But I held her in my hands. And I opened up the pages to the chapter that is focused more on my mother when she was alive, focused more not on my mother's death, but on her life. And I felt this extraordinary release and this extraordinary sense of peace that I have preserved her and that this book will outlast me. It's outlasted her. there's ambivalence because I've also preserved the violence, and I am deeply aware of that, and I'm troubled by that. But I have preserved a bit of my mother. It's not her, it's not all of her, but there's peace in knowing that, again, this thing I created and I shaped will outlive me. And the surprise, that was a surprise, but it was also this feeling that I don't have to keep writing this story anymore. That's how the relationship has changed. I can let go in a way that I couldn't before the book. And there's just something about seeing it in hard copy and holding her. Yeah, I can let go. So I don't know if that answers your question. And again, it depends on how we define relationship, but it feels really good right now in a way I didn't anticipate.
Well, that absolutely answered my question and all of the questions I've asked today. I'm just, sitting with this idea that your mother created and shaped you and you outlived her. And then you create this book, Rabbit Heart, that you create and shape that outlives you and her, but is her through you into the world to share with the rest of us. So thank you so much, Kristine, for the book and for going into depth with me today and sharing about this very complex aspect of when someone dies of violence and how we grieve for them and then we grieve for how they died and how that continues to go along with us throughout the course of our lives. So, yeah.
And I know I mentioned this a little earlier, but I also want to say thank you. I mean, I think about all the silences around grief. I think about, my brother and my father grieved, of course, but it felt very much behind closed doors. I felt alone in my grief for so long. And it is a specific type of grief, so that's part of it, of course, but there's just so much silence around grieving. And I think spaces are being opened up now in a way that I didn't see in the 80s. And of course, you have a presence online in a way that you didn't have then. But what you are doing for your listeners, what you are doing for with conversations like these, the ways that you are helping others just through the voicing of grief and the explorations of it, I think it's remarkable and I think it's necessary. And I know I and others are so grateful for the work that you are doing.
Well, thank you. And just thank you again, Kristine, for your book, Rabbit Heart, for your time today, for being part of Grief Out Loud. Just very grateful.
Me too.
And listeners, I say this each and every single time at the end of an episode, but thank you for being part of this community, for making these conversations of talking about grief out loud mean something, for helping them reach the people who might be helped by what we're talking about here. If you ever want to reach me directly, you can email me at griefoutloud@dougy.org. That's DOUGY.org. That's our main website. If you head there, you'll find all the information about our local programming, all of our free downloadable resources, and each and every episode of Grief Out Loud. Always excited to share that the podcast is sponsored in part by the Chester Stephan Endowment Fund. Grief Out Loud is a production of Dougy Center, the National Grief Center for Children and Families in Portland, Oregon. Thanks again for listening. We hope you'll join us again next time.